Patrick Barway from London Business School. I think my question actually leads into what Helen is going to talk about. The whole idea of sort of associating at the bottom of the income scale, I think, is enormously appealing. Quite hard to do, but very enormously appealing. Obviously, that presupposes that there are people at the bottom of the income scale who have both access and have taken up the technology. And I think that has sort of very, very practical implications for priorities, investment priorities for government. That basically there are three types of things you can spend the money on. One of them is extending superfast broadband beyond what the market will provide. Now that's a very expensive thing to do, and that is currently the top priority of government in terms of resources. Mm-hmm. The second thing you can do is actually ensure universal basic broadband. Now, I don't think any of the applications you were talking about require more than 2 meg. Nice to have, but not actually important, because you're essentially talking about people communicating with each other, not doing anything very high tech. And the third, absolutely crucial thing, which is what Helen's going to talk about, is digital inclusion and the 9 million people who have never used the internet. Would you agree that at present we have the priorities the wrong way round? We're putting big resources into trying to drive superfast broadband beyond what the market will do, BT and Virgin Media, and we're putting minimal resources into universal basic broadband, and we're giving minimal resources to Helen.
Thank you very much indeed. And we'll take the 3 questions. Can I have a lady at the front?
One quite simple question.
Sorry, you say you are?
I'm Mark Carpenter, I'm the director of the National Skills Academy for Social Care, so I was very interested in what you were saying about perhaps using digital media to define these in relation to personalisation for people requiring care. My question really is a very practical one, and that is really about how you see this sort of activity being stimulated at a local level. Do you see it as a role for local government? Is it a role for other agencies? Or is it something that you think will just happen because there are people with time and vision and who will do it? I'm just wondering about the practicality. How you see that happening.
It's the $64,000 question.
Yeah, absolutely. And a question from the lady at the back. Can you step into the light?
It's a religious moment.
What are the what, sorry?
Unforeseen consequences.
I have to foresee the unforeseen. It is a religious moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Phillip Blond, business owner. A couple of questions around capability. So I spent a long time, I was 4.5 years on business and helping people increase their knowledge of how to run businesses. Also as Vice Chairman of the Institute's Director in Buckinghamshire. One of the things that I'm aware of is if you create this environment where people can do these things, the general skills of the population around what you need to do to start and run a business are actually quite low. And so even though people may have the opportunity to do it, then the opportunity may not then lead on to the ability to do it, because that's quite a tough job. And with running a business, whether it's social enterprise or charity or whatever, you also have the issue of liability, personal liability.
All hugely important questions. I'll take the first. The first one first. Access and take of technology. You know, there's some. I forget the exact figure, but it's in the hundreds of thousands, approaching the millions. Approaching a million, I think, of what are called unpleasantly neats, not in education, school or training. Now, those people are often, I think, so is shown, incredibly computer literate. They've turned off school, they've gone into ICT, you know, and they are a huge resource for the very communities that sort of need that resource. And so I tend to agree with you that there's something wrong about a sort of a mass, it's sort of like, it's the wrong model, isn't it? And I think that I'm very interested in, you know, exactly this issue of digital inclusion, and I don't claim to know it in any in any great depth, but my sense is that we would be far better placed if we started to talk about micro measures of Wi-Fi in deprived areas. I think it'd be far more, a far better use of resource to give Wi-Fi in our most disadvantaged areas. And to then use people like NEETs, who cause all sorts of problems, but actually have very high skill levels. You know, one of the things about playing computer games and being interested in that is you create whole new forms of interaction that they could then teach their own communities. Help to use those people to re-engage their own communities and to re-skill their own communities. That's what I would do.
Thank you.
And perhaps we might chat about that later. On the, how do you see this activity being stimulated? This really is the key, isn't it? And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I know of some answers. I know of some answers. We know, for instance, take competition law. I know it sounds odd, but bear with me. One of the most effective ways to enforce genuine competition is visually, on a grid that consumers come and see. There's the price, there's the thing. It's very, very... Competition law doesn't insist on it, but we know from human psychology, and we know from how things work, that's the great deliverer of genuinely open markets. Now, some people try to do it in our gas and utility supplies, but generally it's people who read the rights on the papers who do it. But if this became how you had to deliver it by a type of law requirement, then I think what you actually do is you create conditions for new market entrants. One of the things I'm interested in public procurement is, can we create a form of interface, a tendering interface, that actually is very easy for people to access and use, like online auctions for public procurement. I think it's only 2% at the moment of procurement, but the aim is to drive it up to 20. If you do something like that, you can massively increase new market entrants. And the possibility of having a living and of creating a business for yourself are real, especially in the US and the UK. There's a huge desire for entrepreneurial activity that's trapped by various monopolistic cartel behaviour and regulation. Remember, state regulation is one of the greatest barriers to incumbent to market entrants. So both kind of left and right conspire to close markets, oddly enough. So I think on the social side, what's interesting is that there is no society that is without a society. If you speak to people like, the various social enterprise people, what they find is that actually, even in disadvantaged areas, there's huge numbers of people who suffered as a result of perceived injustices, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's crime, who want to make a difference. And only 1% of social entrepreneurs get funding or capital. And so even in our most deprived communities, there are people who want to make a difference. But what they don't know, what they don't have, is ways to meet other people who want to make a difference. They don't have ways to get capital. And this is what Unlimited talks about, for example, one of the foundations. But what I think digital media could do is start to pattern needs to people who want to deliver needs. I, for instance, have long thought it should be a requirement on local authorities, I'll have to make our next recommendation, to have a web interface where people post their needs, like old people who are lonely, who post their needs, and people who want to meet some needs in their locality. And time banking, which has been talked about for decades, has never really delivered because the model relies on separate communities which we no longer are. But new models of time banking can work, where people who are going to the shops, going to the supermarket, would want to do shopping for others. So what I think would be interesting is asking and learning from people in this audience of what can genuinely work in signalling and stimulating new grouping activity. I think that's what we have to learn from you. Third question. Sorry, well, the first part was digital.
How much of this do you think digital can solve?
I think digital is a necessary but not sufficient condition. But because it's a necessary condition, without it we can't do it. So, and I think that's the most important lesson. What I would like to hear, and I think what government needs to hear, is what works out there in the world that you have. I know from people like BlackBerry or Research in Motion and Vodafone, there are now applications where you can walk into an area and it links you up with a local area. You know, it knows when you're in that local area. Now that's huge. If we can create via mobile phones a kind of micro bottom-up linkage system with all the providers and needs in that area or meeting places in that area, it's a massive resource using our handhelds that can start to stimulate the big society from the bottom up, to start to group people. What if you walked into an area and you thought, God, I like this area. What are the investment opportunities here? And what if we managed to create a whole network of genuinely viable local investment trusts that people could invest in specifically that area, which is, by the way, is what I think macroeconomically we need to do. You're immediately connected. And won't that service pay for itself? Of course it will, because money is being exchanged and return is being generated. So if we can do that with people, and we can do that with the economy, we can also bring people and the economy together. And if we do that on our handhelds, then we really have created a completely different economy. Unforeseen consequences. You're right to raise this because I can foresee some, and this is the digital inclusion agenda. There's lots of people. I mean, I struggle. I don't even know what an app is. Don't tell anyone, for God's sake. But, you know, I struggle. So if I struggle, goodness knows, you know, I'm definitely probably at the bottom of the curve. But others will as well. So I think there's clearly, we can't create a situation where only the cognoscenti can facilitate, but that's a generational thing. I think the interesting question is what if we don't succeed? You know, we'll be left with a media that just kind of has virtual relationships and not real ones. Like that poor woman who committed suicide and put it on Facebook, and nobody came. And sort of what, I mean, it's anecdotal, but it does have a, it's not anecdotal, it happened, but it does have a resonance. That unless we can tie media to reality, unless we can tie kind of interaction to genuine transformative differences on the ground, we risk creating a virtual society that bleeds off our real society. I don't believe that will happen, but that's what television did. But I think the new technology can track back in a good way. Finally, again, another massive true question. Capability. Absolutely. Who can deny that? And it's also charisma, it's also leadership, it's also people thinking, gosh, I can do that. But this is where peer-to-peer comes in again. This is where the idea, you know, if you get companies like Microsoft, like the big companies in our world, sort of make it a social requirement on our staff to give 2 hours volunteering a month. Now imagine if we could group that volunteering, imagine all the expertise, you know, everybody has. Imagine if we could group that volunteering in a really effective way to local capacity. So what we could do is we could take big companies that have kind of very successful volunteering schemes already in place and start to try to build that towards a specific end, business. And that's what I think we should do. We should start to use the resources we have to try and create the capacity in communities that don't have them. And again, this can really, really transform outcomes. So you could get, I would like to see companies adopt schools, for instance. So people wanted to just read to children or talk to children about literature, for instance, or computing. They could hugely, if a big company adopted a local school, imagine all the resources that could go into that. And then people would feel that volunteering had a real impact. So that's the sort of resource that I think we need to do. And again, government needs to help facilitate that. But I better shut up now. So, all brilliant questions. Thank you very much.